Welcome, folks, to 52 Living Ideas. Today, we are going to be talking about John Boyd's paper, Destruction and Creation. Now, John Boyd has had a tremendous impact on my life and on my way of thinking. Though he's known as a military strategist, what he's actually doing is epistemology. It's a way of thinking. And this paper is the best example demonstrating his way of thinking. So we're going to go through this paper carefully, and I'll make whatever observations I can as we go along. And let's see what we can do. After the presentation, you'll get to go to the breakout rooms, discuss these ideas, and then come back and talk about your takeaways, put questions on the table. So that's the plan. All right. So who is John Boyd? So John Boyd had three different careers. First, his first career was that of a fighter pilot. And there he was known as 40-second Boyd, that is 40 seconds. Now, why 40 seconds? That's because he had a running challenge to all the folks, all the fighter pilots, saying that you choose any position and any speed of both the aircrafts, and in 40 seconds, I'll be behind you, shooting you down. And he won most of the times. So that's why it was called 40-second Boyd. His second career was that of airplane designer. He's the father of F-16. Before him, the way in which planes were designed was they were designed for power. They were heavy planes which could go very fast, had immense amount of power, but very poor maneuverability. Boyd's insight was that fighter planes need to have maneuverability. They need to be able to change their course, their orientation, their speed fast. If they can do that, then they are more effective. And his third career was that of a military strategist. And there he is known for the Ooda loop. It is essentially a way of acting faster than your enemy. Ooda loop has had a profound impact on the US military. The Secretary of Defense credited him, John Boyd, for the effectiveness of the first Gulf War. And so did many people, including General Dan Bolger, who was here. So that's what he is. But what we are going to do today is we are actually going to look at the only paper that he produced, called Destruction and Creation. All right. So this is the abstract of the paper. So we're going to go through it carefully. So first sentence, to comprehend and cope with our environment, we develop mental patterns or concepts of meaning. Let's just pause on this. So you develop concepts for a purpose. What is the purpose of your concepts? The purpose of concepts is to comprehend our environment, take in and cope with it, to basically shape it. So it's a question of taking in information and to act. And in order to do that, in order to perform this life of responding to and shaping the environment, we form concepts. That's the purpose. The purpose of this paper is to sketch out how we destroy and create these patterns of concepts to permit us to both shape and be shaped by a changing environment. This is really powerful prose. See, each of these words is critical. First, the environment is changing. World is changing all the time. You want to be shaped by it. You want to respond to it, and you want to shape it. And in order to do that, we use concepts. In order to cope, comprehend and cope with a changing environment, we need to destroy and create the conceptual structures that we have in order to match the world as it changes. In this sense, the discussion also literally shows why we cannot avoid this kind of activity if we intend to survive on our own terms. So this is not an optional thing. We need to be able to do this in order to live and thrive in a changing world. The activity is dialectic in nature, generating both disorder and order that emerges as a changing and expanding universe of mental concepts matched to a changing and expanding universe of observed reality. Okay, so again, let's break this down. There is a changing and expanding universe of observed reality. And you're trying to match a changing and expanding universe of mental concepts to that changing and expanding universe of observed reality. And in the process of doing that, you are generating disorder and order at the same time. You're taking things apart and you're putting them back together relentlessly. This is what we're going to be discussing today. This is what the paper is about. Now, this is the most important sentence in the whole paper. And most people who study Boyd's OODA loop don't focus on it. He says, what is the purpose of doing all of this? What is the purpose of it? Because if you don't have a purpose, what are you doing this for? It's not an intellectual game that you're playing. The goal is to improve our capacity for independent action. Hold this in your head. Please write this down. This is the goal, to improve our capacity for independent action. Okay, capacity for action, capacity for independent action, and you're trying to improve it. That's what you're doing. That's the goal. Now, why independent action? Why? Now, people say, okay, aren't we social beings? Yes, we are pursuing our independent action in a social context. And as a result of that, we have to cooperate with people and compete with people. When do we cooperate with people? We cooperate with people when cooperating with them, working with them, increases our capacity for independent action. When you're working in the team, what you can get done is much more than what you could do by yourself. So you cooperate with people. Now, when there are bad people trying to hurt you, trying to destroy your life, or trying to cheat you, you are competing against it because they are trying to undermine your capacity of independent action. So you do both cooperation and competing in order to improve your capacity for independent action. Now, again, look at the pros here. Okay, look at the power of it. We are improving our capacity. It's not about any particular action. It is your ability to act that you are trying to improve relentlessly. That's what we're after. So the purpose of this entire method, which is an epistemological method, it's a method of thinking, is to improve our capacity for independent action. So what does it take to act in a changing world? We need concepts. Okay? So this is about creating concepts. It says there are two ways in which we can develop and manipulate mental concepts to represent observed reality. We can start from a comprehensive whole and break it down to its particulars, or we can start with the particulars and build towards a comprehensive whole. Saying it another way, but in a related sense, we can go from general to specific, or from the specific to general. A little reflection here reveals that deduction is related to proceeding from general to specific, while induction is related to proceeding from specific to general. Summing up, we can see that general to specific is related to deduction, analysis, and differentiation, while specific to general is related to induction, synthesis, and integration. So what we have here is that we have concepts which are abstractions. And then there is life, and there is world, which is concretes. And we are going relentlessly between them. We are proceeding inductively when we observe things and put them together at higher and higher levels of concepts. We are, as when we are applying the concepts, we are taking abstractions and applying them to concretes. So you're relentlessly going up and down. So you're going from percepts to concepts and concepts to percepts relentlessly. And both these processes are active at any given, in this entire process of achieving the goal that we have of improving our capacity for independent action. Okay, so that's what we are doing. So now let's first take the downward movement. Now, keeping these two opposing idea chains in mind, let us move on a somewhat different tack. Imagine, if you will, a domain, a comprehensive whole, and its constituent elements or parts. Now, imagine another domain and its constituent parts. Repeating this idea over and over, we can imagine any number of domains and parts corresponding to each. Further, we can see that such unstructuring, so he's saying that, look, there are all these domains, all these systems of ideas that you have created. And these are typically in multiple domains, separated from each other. Now, what you can do is that you can take apart these domains while keeping the elements and then put them back together in a different way. Further, we can see that such unstructuring or destruction of many domains, to take apart the concepts, to break the correspondence of each with its respective constituents, is related to deduction, analysis, or differentiation. We call this kind of unstructuring destructive deduction. So you're basically taking apart a structure that you had built before. Okay, so that's one part of the process. The second part of the process is creative induction. Now what you have is that you have taken apart the ideas that you had, and now faced with such disorder or chaos, we can reconstruct. How can we reconstruct order or meaning? Going back to the idea chain of specific to general, induction, synthesis, and integration, the thought occurs that a new domain or a concept can be formed if we can find some common qualities or attributes or operations among some or many of these constituents swimming in this sea of anarchy. And through such connecting threads that produce meaning, we synthesize constituents from, hence across the domains we have just shattered. Linking particulars together in this manner, we can form a new domain or concept. Okay, so what he's saying is that you take things apart, and now you start to see what connections you can see amongst these elements that you've gotten from multiple sources, and you try to put them together in a better order. Linking particulars together in this manner, we can form a new domain or concept. Clearly, such synthesis would indicate that we have generated something new and different from what previously existed. Going back to our idea chain, it follows that creativity is related to induction, synthesis, and integration, since we proceeded from unstructured bits and pieces to a new general pattern or concept. We call such action a creative or constructive induction. Okay, so this is basically induction. This is taking pieces that you have. Some of these pieces would be things that you have taken apart. Some of these pieces would be new pieces that are provided by reality. Because reality is changing all the time, new things are coming into view, and you notice some kind of lack of harmony, some kind of contradictions between the structures that you have and the feedback that you're getting, or amongst the structures that you have. So you take the structures apart, take in all the new elements, and try to put them back together. And this is really the heart of creativity, what he calls creative induction. Now, this last point is very interesting, very important. It is important to note that the crucial or key step that permits this creative induction is the separation of the particulars from its previous domain by destructive deduction. Without this unstructuring, the creation of a new structure cannot proceed, since the bits and pieces are still tied together as meaning within unchallenged domains or concepts. See, people want to hold on to the hierarchy of concepts that they have. And if you say that whatever I have is good enough, and people tend to hold on to these ideas even in face of evidence to the contrary. When you do that, you won't be able to create a new concept because your entire focus is full of the concepts that you previously had. In order to be truly creative, you have to be willing to take apart your previous structures, take in all the new data, and try to put together it in a way which is more harmonious, which captures the relations better than your previous concepts did. If you keep on, if you're fixated on the concepts that you're already formed, you will never form a new concept. You have to be willing to let go. The other part of it is just you need to take in multiple fields. We talk about, this is Comprehensivist Wednesday. We talk about the advantage of multidisciplinary approach. This is exactly what he's talking about. The more fields you take in, the more you're going to be able to do that. You're going to be able to see that once the field that you are focused on right now is not as well structured as another field you're seeing, there are missing parts in it. There are things that are unnecessarily complicated. It's only by taking in multiple fields like this, multiple hierarchies of concepts, and then taking them apart and putting them back together, that you can produce something truly creative and truly responsive to the demands of life. Now, this one is a metaphysical point. This is a very deep point he makes, and I'm going through it very quickly. I strongly urge you to read the paper that I put in the meetup. It's a very short paper, very accessible paper, and very deep. He says there are three things you have to remember. Let's go from backwards. One is entropy. And this is second law of thermodynamics, which states that entropy of any system will keep growing. Now, that's a real challenge to life, because life requires achievement of order, whereas the entropy is pushing things in the direction of disorder. So how do we handle this? This is a major problem. Let's go to the first one, incompleteness. This is from Godel. I don't understand it too well, but essentially what it holds is that a system cannot be consistent, cannot be proven to be consistent within itself. It needs to have a reference outside it to support it. So any system which becomes insular basically begins to die. That's the core idea. It's like, a closed system cannot survive. A system needs to be open for and responsive to the external, to things external to it in order to survive. And the one in the middle, indeterminacy. This is Heisenberg's point. Now we're talking about actual human action. Okay, so this is human action. Us as beings are much bigger than a photon or something like that. So we actually cause a lot of disturbance in the observation. So there is, our actions as an observer itself is going to create uncertainty and or generate disorder. So these are three big ways in which disorder gets created. And I invite you to read the paper to look at each, the seriousness of each of them. So the question is, we are trying to achieve, again, go back to our goal. Our goal is to increase our capacity for independent action. So how do we do that in the face of these things? What's the solution? So here we come to the heart of the whole thing, which brings everything together. Okay, so far we have pieces. Now this is describing the process in greater amount of detail. So it's basically going to be 4 slides. This is this last section on destruction and creation. So we've seen what the problem is, these 3 things. What's the way out? Fortunately, there is a way out. Remember, as previously shown, we can forge a new concept by applying destructive deduction and creative induction mental operations. Also remember, in order to perform these dialectic mental operations, we must first shatter the rigid conceptual patterns firmly established in our mind. This is crucial. People hold on to whatever patterns that they have. He puts parenthetically, this should not be too difficult since rising confusion and disorder is already helping us to undermine any patterns. So that life is giving you a continuous feedback about the mismatches. Next, so we have to do this destructive deduction, which actually increases the entropy, and then creative induction, which increases order in a local way. So you are increasing the disorder by taking apart everything that you had and then increasing the local order of your life by putting things back together again. Next, we must find some common qualities, attributes, or operations to link isolated facts, perceptions, ideas, impressions, interactions, observations, etc., together as possible concepts to represent the real world. Finally, we must repeat this unstructuring and restructuring until we develop a concept that begins to match up with reality. By doing this, we find that the uncertainty and disorder generated by an inward-oriented system talking to itself can be offset by going outside and creating new system. Okay, so this is a crucial thing. The thing that you have to avoid is this inward-oriented system that is talking to itself. And the only way to do that, only way to offset it, is by going outside taking in information from there and creating a new system. Simply stated, uncertainty and related disorder can be diminished by the direct artifice of creating a higher and broader, more general concept to represent reality. Okay, so that is the solution. Moment you create a concept, it starts to die. Moment you create something and start applying it, the discrepancy between it and the world starts to increase. You have to be responsive to the feedback that you're getting from the world to keep updating this concept. Let's go to the second slide on this. However, once again, when we begin to turn inward and use the new concept within its own pattern of ideas and interactions to produce a finer grain match with observed reality, we note that the new concept and its matchup with observed reality begins to self-destruct just as before. Accordingly, the dialectic cycle of destruction and creation begins to repeat itself once again. In other words, as suggested by Godel's proof of incompleteness, we imply that the process of structure, unstructure, restructure is repeated endlessly in moving to higher and broader levels of elaboration. In this unfolding drama, the alternating cycle of entropy increase towards more and more disorder and entropy decrease towards more and more order appears to be one part of the controlling mechanism that literally seems to drive and regulate this alternating cycle of destruction and creation towards higher and broader levels of elaboration. Now, it's important to know that you are actually increasing your local order. You are increasing your capacity for independent action because you're at each level when you take apart what you had before and put something together which is more responsive to reality, more general, more powerful, more effective. You are increasing your capacity for action. So you're creating a lot of entropy by taking things apart, but you're decreasing the entropy and increasing the order by putting things back together. Now, in relating this deductive slash inductive activity to the basic goal discussed in the beginning, I believe we have uncovered a dialectic engine that permits construction of decision models needed by individuals and societies for determining and monitoring actions in an effort to improve their capacity for independent action. Okay, now this is the one of the hallmarks of Boyd's approach to ideas is that ideas and concepts are for the sake of action. They're all action oriented. Most of the epistemological approaches by most philosophers regard knowledge almost as an end in itself. And the looping back to action is almost over, as a afterthought. What he's saying is that it is for the sake of action, for the sake of independent action. So, so he is in the pragmatic, people like William James camp, that you're trying, the purpose of ideas is to act in the world. Furthermore, since the engine is directed towards satisfying this basic aim or goal, it follows that the goal-seeking effort itself appears to be the other side of control mechanism that seems also to drive and regulate the alternating cycle of destruction and creation towards higher and broader levels of elaboration. So you are continuously getting the feedback about are your actions, is your capacity for action better? You're learning So don't think of it as action. Think of it as testing. You're testing your ideas relentlessly, and you're using the results of the test to remake the ideas. In this paper, Destruction and Creation, I think he wrote in about 1974 or so. He's done another paper called Conceptual Spiral, which I recommend very highly, which shows how this process works in two fields: field of science and field of technology. So if this seems too aggressive to you, consider field of technology. When when you build this iPhone, right? Once you build the iPhone and you start distributing it, your next thing has to be to say, okay, what's next? If you're not doing that, you're not going to survive as a company. When, as a scientist, you come up with something, you are testing it and you are using that test data to ask more questions. It's a relentless process of improvement along the same lines. So he demonstrates the operation of this deductive destruction and inductive creation in science and technology in that paper called Conceptual Spiral. This is the final one on this. Taken together, the entropy notion associated with the second law of thermodynamics and the basic goal of individuals and societies seem to work in dialectic harmony in driving and regulating the destructive/creative or deductive/inductive action that we have described herein as a dialectic engine. The result is a changing and expanding universe of mental concepts matched to a changing and expanding universe of observed reality. As indicated earlier, these mental concepts are employed as decision models by individuals and societies for determining and monitoring actions needed to cope with their environment and to improve their capacity for independent action. So again, he talks about this as being the basis for decisions and to drive actions. Okay, so I want to now go to the core idea that he has of the OODA loop and show you how it applies there. This is John Boyd's original diagram of OODA loop. Okay, so I want to point out a few things there. So it is observe, orient, decide, and act. The first thing I would point out is that note how large and how complex that orient element is. That's where that's the heart of where the deductive destruction and creative induction is taking place. What you're doing is that you're observing, and don't think of it as observing really. What is going on there is that you're really observing how your ideas or plans are mismatched. What you're really paying closest attention to is the mismatch, and which is what you're using with all the elements that you have in order to take apart what you had previously and put it back together. And that's essentially going on in the orient module here. Okay, so it's observe, orient, decide, and act. And you're doing this orientation in order to decide and act. And in so doing, you're changing the world. Now, the best place to actually see this is in the context of war, because that's where the world is changing fast and your actions are having tremendous impact. So let me give you an example here. So it's another way of thinking about it is that most of the creative induction that you're doing is you're observing and orienting, you're putting things together, and then you're acting based on that. So let me actually go ahead and show you an example of this. The example that we got from General Bolger, who was here. I recommend his video very highly. He was figuring out how to fight the insurgents. And he came up with a very nimble, very light infantry model of fighting insurgents. And one of the most ingenious things that he had is that he had two headquarters, very small headquarters, but two headquarters. One headquarters would be focused only on planning, only on figuring out what is going on and figuring out what they're going to do the next day. And one headquarters would be, so there would be gold team and black team. And the first headquarter will be focused on planning. The second headquarter will be focused on execution that day. So that day they would, and the next day it would switch. So suppose the black team is doing the execution today, actually running the operation, running the war. The gold team, which is identical, to the black team, is taking in all the information and coming up with the next order plan. So it is actually separation of people who are executing things from people who are doing the orientation. And the next day, the command will shift to the gold team, who would start executing based on the new orientation or the new concepts that they had formed. And the black team would switch places and they would start observing and orienting, planning for the next day. So this is a very good way of talking about separation between that. See how much flexibility of action and how much distance from your own biases this kind of system gives you. It's very easy to get caught up into things. And let me see what's next. Let me just pause over here. Let me stop sharing. So this is a very quick overview of the core ideas in this destruction and creation. To sum up, what we are trying to do is we are trying to increase the capacity of our independent action. That's what we are trying to do. And in order to do that, the worst thing you can do is to hold on to the ideas that you have, regardless of what is going on with the world. Your ideas have to be responsive to the new data. The other part is that you are relentlessly acting on the ideas and making significant change in the world and in yourself. And you're taking that input in order to put things together. All right, so that's a very quick overview. And what I'm going to do now is that I'm going to start the breakout rooms. And the breakout rooms will run for 20 minutes. You can discuss these ideas amongst yourself, raise whatever questions, objections that you have, discuss it amongst yourself, and then come back. And when you come back, you can tell me about your takeaways, what you got from this, and you can ask me questions. You can do both, or just takeaways or just questions, okay? So I'm starting the breakout rooms now. See you back in 20 minutes. Looking forward to hearing from you. Welcome back, folks. Welcome back. All right, so it's time for takeaways and questions. So you can go ahead and talk about what you got from the presentation, and you can also ask questions. So we'll go one by one. As always, we've got 4 rules. Number 1, type exclamation mark in chat or raise your hand in Zoom in order to speak. Number 2, keep on topic. Number 3, be brief. Number 4, feel free to speak your mind, disagree with anybody on anything, and do so courteously. Next up is going to be Bowden, followed by Shaf. Bowden.
Yeah, I like these conceptual exercises. It's sort of the area of abstraction. The only problem is that they need to be matched by some case studies so that they can be concretized. I mean, you have a proposition in terms of a theoretical understanding of the way one adapts to reality and tests it. This is really the scientific method, I think. So what it does need is a testable exercise, where a concrete one, where one sees the operation or the methods being applied. These are very practical, transactional, pragmatic approach. There are certain magical thinking and other things that might threaten it, but they might actually be outside the bounds of this practical exercise, and might not be reconciled with it, or in different parallel realities. Also, principles and values, they could lie outside of it. One can work using realistic methodology, applying this methodology in achieving ideals that could be outside of this practicality. But I think this is a very good class, and I think it just needs some practical realization of the methodology in real terms, so we can understand it better.
Wonderful. Thank you, Bowden. So what I recommend is that you should look at Marines, because Marines really took this to heart. Marines was the first first part of the US military that really embraced John Boyd's ideas. So his ideas are implemented in the Marine manuals. So I would look at Marine manuals, as well as look at all the Marine operations since about 1980s to present. All of them, you would find like plenty of examples of how to apply this, what is the context in which to apply it. That's where, so it's like, I mean, as far as ideas go, this particular way of thinking has just enormous amount of data behind it, because I was talking to folks who were in the Persian Gulf War last time, and the gentleman who was in Persian Gulf War, he was saying that about 85% of the Marines used these ideas during the Persian Gulf War, about 75% of the special operations, only about 30% of the army. Still, it was, it was significant. John Boyd was called in by both Schwarzkopf and Dick Cheney to come up with the strategy for what is called the left hook in the first Gulf War, and implementing that entire strategy. So it has got a very large base of actual concrete evidence that you can look at. So those are the historical things I would look at. Next up is Shaf, Joe, and Jade. Shaf, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Right, so I thought, yeah, very interesting discussions from the breakout room based on this subject. When I was listening to it, and when I was like formulating in my head ways to, I guess, think about this, the first things that were coming to my mind is, well, maybe it's just because this has been applied to so many disciplines today, but a lot of it sounds like there's some, for example, I'm in tech, so a lot of this sounds like common sense, actually, to reevaluate, your thinking periodically so you can actually improve your system. So I originally started thinking about who would have a difficulty actually applying this. Like, would it be people who are maybe very religious, for instance, or would it be people who have very rigid cognitive biases, or very rigid, traditions, or very rigid principles? What I guess group of individuals or group of groups may have a hard time, adjusting to this kind of thinking. So just ideating on that a little bit in the room. And I heard one other really quick interesting point was that it was brought up in the room, was that I think it seemed that the real challenge was applying it to yourself, and kind of fighting yourself really to make sure that you're always consistently doing this and not like, sticking to a belief that may no longer have validity.
Excellent point. So regarding, who would find it easy and who would find it harder, I think a scientist, a good scientist, or anybody in tech, as you're saying, whether it was wonderful to say that, okay, this kind of common sense, it's really great that it's common sense. And it is common sense in technology, and it is common sense in good science. But in many, many fields, I mean, if you look at it at a historical level, kind of religious points of view, any kind of ideology where people get stuck on an ideology, any kind of disciplines, maybe university disciplines where people get hooked into some ideas and they try to hold on to the ideas, try to prove their ideas because it's their ideas. So there are many, many examples. Any field where the change is very fast, like technology, like science, like military. Even in military, they found that it's the Marines who are in the middle of the maximum amount of change, who really kind of saw it like that. And they were already doing a version of it before, whereas something like an army took a lot longer to get on board. So it's a question of how much of change that is there. And your point about yourself versus others is it's a very crucial point. And that's why I think, the ideas of actually having conversations with other people, actually listening to the other people, actually hearing their feedback, spoken and unspoken, direct or indirect, is crucial, because that is the kind of other people's feedback, especially the ones that you trust. It's not that everybody's feedback is good, but people whom you trust, whom you have vetted, and who have a record of giving good feedback and who want the best for you, are a crucial source of correcting your views. So very good points. Thank you. Next up is Joe, Jade, and Barry. Joe.
So I guess I'll start off with the question is the idea that how this model could work within your four subsystems model. And that is pretty clear to me. Like, but I would just like to hear a little bit more about that, especially when you're talking about the dialectical engine.
Absolutely.
And, that stuck out to me. And especially when you're talking about if you're managing yourself by principles, then how the goals within that, in a goal-oriented framework, really fits in nicely within that system. Go ahead.
Okay, so yeah. So if I forget, remind me at the end of this meetup. I'm going to show something exactly about that, but I want to do that at the end of the takeaways.
Okay. So yeah, and I mean, and the other thing is just a fantastic job of consolidating that information. That was amazing, by the way. It was a fantastic presentation. And what I really took away is the idea of having to really have a mental model to really facilitate independent action. And that's what this is really all about. How do we create the mental model? And that works both with the general and the specific. So that works with the individual as well as the organizational. And this is why it's a very interesting model to me, because it's kind of like top down, bottom up. And it works at multiple levels. And I saw a lot of other things and I'll just say this briefly about how this relates to some of the other meetups that we've been covering, and how people with even Jordan Peterson's Destruction and Creation, and how, order and chaos and dealing with unknowns. It really brings it together nicely with the OODA loop as an actual practical model to make this work. And the idea that he added in with the way systems are constructed, and that they're inevitably there's going to be chaos in them and they're incomplete, is really just, now that's far beyond my mathematical or anything capabilities, but it gives me the conceptual understanding as to why these things need to occur and why you need to continually reinvent and have a mental model that is adaptive and evolutionary to your system. So,
Wonderful.
so that's all.
Yeah. So I'll comment on two things. I mean, one thing that kind of sets Boyd apart from people like Jordan Peterson, because Jordan Peterson is talking exactly about the same thing.
Right.
He's talking about order and chaos. But what John Boyd has on the top of that, he says not only there is order and chaos, but this is how you deal with order and chaos on a systematic basis. And it's a much more kind of practical approach. It is much more kind of hard-nosed, measured approach. Okay, what are you doing here? What are you doing there? So it's just, the goals of both are the same. But I think because Boyd comes from the military base, and where these are all issues of life and death. And so there is an intensity to kind of solving the problems and importance of solving the problems right away, which allows him to think about it in a far more practical, far more applied, far more intense way than other folks who identify that that issue exists. The second thing is that one hallmark of it is that he's always saying that the purpose of having more mental models is to make decisions to act. So it has all the mental models are only as good as their predictive capability of saying, okay, what do you expect to happen? What do you need to do based on that? And then you're doing that, and then you're bringing in the result of that. So the action component is a very large part of this entire system in how Boyd thinks, and that is very different from most approaches to ideas. Thanks, Joe. Next up is Jade, Barry, and Tova. Jade, go ahead.
All right, so bear with me while I try to make this make sense.
Sure.
To the people outside of my brain, but I think the first thing that came to my mind is everything we know is right until we know it's wrong. I feel like that's the underlying thing of all of this, and the basic thing is like it's like critical thinking on steroids, and the crux of all of this working is one, your skill of observation and perception, and your ability to analyze your skills of observation and perception. Because even if we're going to saying we need to take the outside information and then vet who's qualified to advise us or give us thoughts, that's even difficult. Because if you don't have the skills of perception to figure out what's in front of you, this is going to be very difficult. That vetting system is an assessment system is going to be hard. And then after that, I was kind of wondering, this on a certain level, kind of when people don't do this, I feel like they end up hitting an existential crisis, a shattered schema, or it's just conflict ensues. And that is usually what ends up forcing people to do this process. It's almost like we're striking preemptively, as opposed to waiting for the crisis to happen and then responding to the crisis, where you usually can't stop, think, and figure it out. We're striking preemptively. And then also, again, that common sense concept of like, you react to what's in front of you. But unfortunately, people, we miss a lot. A lot can be right in front of our faces. It doesn't matter how great you are, even if you think of the best scam artists. Like they could get scammed. For whatever reason, humans, we are not able to always see what's in front of our faces. So I feel like our humanity kind of gets in the way of this, even when we're really good at it.
Excellent.
And that's where I'll stop for right now.
Excellent.
Although like a million other things that are like very disjointed, but yeah.
This is fantastic. So firstly, proven right until proven wrong. I mean, one of the key things about this view is to hold open the possibility that you're wrong. So that's huge. You're absolutely right that skill of observation is critical, and not only skill of observation, because really the observation that matters is to see something that is very painful. Like, people don't want to see that they're completely screwing up or they're completely wrong about something. So it is the willingness to take the emotional hit of saying, oh, this is just bad. People tend to push that away. So it is that courage to face the negative that is needed. I really like the point about preemptive strike. I like the way in which Jordan Peterson puts it. Chaos is there. Either you can face it unwillingly, or you can go ahead and face it willingly. You can, there is a dragon there. You can either choose to attack it, or you can wait for it to attack. And facing it and being proactive as opposed to reactive is the heart of this system. You're saying that enemy is there, you have to be proactive. That is your best chance, actually. Those are the things that I would say at this point. Thanks, Shed. Great observations. Next up is Barry, Tova, and Kevin. Barry.
As I get older, I find there's less time in my life. You do the calculations, and I guess, and then you want to become more efficient and more effective. And I think this approach is very helpful, because since my wife died, I picked up a lot of habits that I never had before. I never was a painter. I did a little bit of poetry when I never did yoga. And I found all these things help me emotionally, but I find it's really important if you want to increase your life and you want to increase your life and you want to increase your span in your lifespan, that you're constantly trying to improve yourself to be more effective. And right now I'm working on a problem I do yoga, painting, I play the piano, I compose music, write poetry, and I'm trying to figure out how I can combine these and integrate these activities. So I also like the disco dance, and so I came up with this idea, yoga disco, and so I like the idea of breaking down my yoga into its different poses and sequences, as well as disco into various movements and sequences, and see how they mix and how they match, and I think this is where the polymath, really can. And I just want to leave you with one thing that I talked about in our last Sunday, is I try to integrate what other people segregate, and I disintegrate what other people integrate, with the intent to be more effective and efficient and increasing my flow in life.
Wonderful, Barry. Absolutely. One thing I would say is that working on many different fields is the easiest way of challenging whatever you hold in any particular field. Because what happens is that you're looking at all of these things in parallel, and they are all challenging and working with each other. And you are able to see patterns and conflicts and things like that. Similarly, doing something like this, where we're speaking openly about our ideas with each other and hearing other people very carefully for as much, as closely as possible, to see what they are saying and how it is different and what is the different angle they are coming, if there is any conflict, and trying to resolve it. That's a very powerful way of building your ideas and correcting your ideas. So more input from more sources, more fields is the fertile ground from which you can do all of it. And you're absolutely right. It's kind of, integration and disintegration and integration all the time. Thanks, Barry. Next up is Tova, Kevin, and Trevor. Tova.
Okay, well, I don't know if this is right, and I don't know if I understood this correctly, but we'll see. So, like, Heisenberg principle, like, within this context, was stating that when the intended distinction between observer and observed begins to disappear, the uncertainty value hides or masks phenomena of behavior. So I was just wondering if Boyd uses this model of the, this principled model in approaching racial bias, in that, what ways would Boyd argue that new information added to a previous idea of someone or types of someone's, for instance, enemies in the war, because it's very, specific to, his outlook, which is, are you friend or foe? Which could be arguably the same principle in which racism and, the cognitive and racial biases that we have towards purple people and green people like exist in the same realm.
No, I mean, I'm familiar with his approach to various things.
Oh.
Like, let me give you a couple of examples on that. So firstly, there is, I mean, one of his core principles is that you have to win over civilians. That, whenever you're fighting, you have to, the party which actually wins over the bystanders wins. So you have to, even when you're fighting something which is negative, you have to do that, and that's a kind of a core military principle. Even General Bolger, who was here, he was talking exactly about the same thing. So that's kind of core part of the military. So that's what I would say. But I don't think so that's all I would say on that. Thanks, Tova. Next up is Kevin, Trevor, and Brian. Kevin.
Yeah, thank you. Nice to talk about the creative induction and destructive deduction. Our take room is about we discussing being in reality and Heisenberg's principle and perception of reality. For me, my takeaway is time and space is changing. It's different. It used to be. We interpret time and it's now. The space is here. So like we currently. One interesting thing, we as human beings, we 99.9% generalize is the same, similar to the next person beside you. However, seems like we use 99% of the time energy to fighting how to get along with another person. It's very interesting, and we only focus on 1.0%. It's very specific. That's from your generalization to the specific. That's my take. For example, let's see, should we wear a mask or not during pandemic time? We still not agree, totally agree with society. I got my question is,
Sure.
what's your thought about how religion to keep the faith, adapt to a new reality? What I would say is a little bit a challenge for religion people. Thank you.
No, are you saying that how does this apply to religious people? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, how let's say we say that you need to keep, let's say, do an induction, deduction, it's like a circle, keep feedback, then you do a thing here.
Right.
Like feedback, so we already so much feedback. For if I'm have my own religion, it's hard to absorb. I only believe the people I believe and the book or the thing. So how can I keep it, from
Right. See, religion is a very large field, and it actually encompasses a lot of different views. So, for example, there is a kind of religion where there are kind of trends in religion where they say, okay, this is the book, and these are the people who are the authorities in the book, and whatever they say goes. But somebody like, say, Martin Luther was against that. He says, no, no, no. Each person has a direct connection to God, and each person should figure out, what is right and what is God on their own. So moving the locus. So again, moving the locus, if you're accepting a system that is out there in the society, then you're fragile. You're buying into it and you're holding on to it regardless of evidence. But moment you move it, saying that you have to grasp it, you have the ability of evolving your journey of what religion means to you. And that gives you the same ability of reworking the concepts as you see fit. In the Indian religion, it's a Gnostic religion where it is believed that each person has a direct connection in God, in fact, is God, if they really are kind of, if they look at it, they think that there is God in each of us. And it's all about getting to kind of accepting the fact and forgetting about all kinds of appearances to the contrary. Again, that's a religion where you can keep updating your ideas about what you truly are without that. So this is, so there are some variations of religions which are consonant with this view and some which are not. Next up is Trevor, Brian Nelson, and Anne. Trevor. Trevor, go ahead. Or I can read out your question. You need to unmute yourself. Go ahead.
I was muted. Yeah, well, my question is in the chat, two-part question. First part is, what is the most complex model that he's built using this methodology? Because I'm interested in the various types of software that a person might use. And then in our breakout room, we were talking about building a model of reality itself. The goal being trying to essentially force some degree of enlightenment into the world, as opposed to sitting and waiting for it to happen, which is never going to happen.
Okay, so let me answer that in terms of what's the most complex model. So firstly, you have to realize that Boyd was extremely smart about this. He did not write a book. This is actually an exception. This is the only paper that he wrote, just 7 pages. That's it. Everything else that he did was actual presentations. So he's very much aware. And what he, like Chet Richards, who was here, I recommend the interview of Chet Richard that I did, which is there on YouTube on our channel, 52 Living Ideas on YouTube. He was a close associate of Boyd. And Boyd's view was always that if whatever I'm doing, whatever I'm writing makes you think less, then just burn my writing. Okay, so it's all about relentlessly building models and reworking the model. So it's not like a static model. Even the Ooda cycle, as most people use it, it's just 4 phases, doesn't really capture the grandeur of his thought. So it's better thought of as a method of thinking rather than a model of the world, because model of the world is a variable that he's continuously, that's what he calls concepts or a system of concepts. And that's a variable to him. And it must be a variable because the world is changing. And what you're really trying to come up with is this model of the method that you're using of this creation.
No, I mean,
go ahead.
I understand the method, but I'm literally talking about building a model of the world. I realize this is an ambitious project, but I'm not joking.
No, that's fine. But all he would say is that make sure you keep updating it. Don't fall in love with it. That's what he would say. Moment you fall in love with it, you're finished. That's
well, of course. That's doing it wrong.
Yes,
right.
Exactly. Wonderful. Thank you, Trevor. Next up is I don't know if Brian Nelson is here. Nope. So then it's going to be Anne. Anne, go ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to just add some thought about framework in which this operates. Somebody said at the outset, that religious people would have a harder time with that. I guess because, religious people may ascribe to a certain framework. Now, However, I don't think that's unique to religious people, and I don't think they would have any harder time for this reason. The Marines are operating with a framework that they're not deconstructing and reconstructing. That is the defense of the United States. They're not, deconstructing that framework any more than a religious person who believes in God is necessarily deconstructing the notion of God. It's a framework. It's a given. So I think it's a little simplistic to say that we can be constantly in a state of flux and uncertainty and instability. That there are frameworks. The Marines are also operating within the framework of their policies and procedures. They're not suddenly, any given Marine's not saying, I've just deconstructed the hierarchy of authority here. And so I'm not going to listen to the general anymore. I've deconstructed and reconstructed that. It doesn't work that way. There are frameworks. So there's no reason someone who operates within a system of religious belief should not be any more able to use this model with either aspects within that framework or something entirely outside of that framework, like a business problem. So I think it's a little simplistic to dismiss all religious people just because they have a framework. And I say that because I think everyone operates within a framework, or else they're just, they're just in a constant state of identity crisis. So anyway, that's my thought. So thanks.
Thank you, Anne. Okay, so let me respond to that. So it's a question of whether your framework is responsive to life or not. Now, if it happens, so for example, I mean, again, I would bring up Louis Sullivan's principle of form follows function. As long as the form is meeting the function, those parts of the form will remain. And to the extent to which the form is stopping you from achieving the function, then you have to let go of that part of the form. So it is that you have this hierarchy of concepts, and some of it is more stable than others, but all of it is subject to whether it supports life or not, whether it is increasing your capacity for independent action. Now, if anything, any part of the structure, any part of the form that has demonstrably, continually helped you increasing your capacity for action, you will keep. And even in the reorganizations of things, those parts would remain. So it's not as if everything goes away. It's reconstituted in a way where things that are actually supporting the function have a persistence, but each of it is earned by the fact that that is actually supporting life. Next up is Brian Nelson. Brian, go ahead.
I think Anne actually anticipated some of my point, but I'd like to try to make it a little differently. She talked about frameworks. I'd like to talk about commitments. If, let's say, with my wife or my employer, she talked about the Army situation, but if I were to tell them that I've adopted this John Boyd perspective on life and bring that to the altar with me when I'm getting married and say, this will work for me as long as it maximizes my independent activity. I don't think I'm going to get a buy-in. And so it won't, I think marriage does maximize activity, and I would never get a buy-in because I wouldn't get a commitment. So I think that's true in many, many areas of life, in exactly the way that that Anne has flagged it. So to the extent that beyond that, let's say, to the extent that I have made a commitment and other people are relying on it, I think going back on that commitment to enhance my independence of activity might not be a good call, might not be the best call. You could say, yeah, you want to negotiate it, but then that leads to my last point, which is, I don't think independence of activity is really an ultimate goal. You can say that for a building, or you can say that about a Marine in a context. His ultimate goal is specified, but independent activity, to what end, for what purpose? Let's say just in terms of economics, simple economics, I want to have the highest annual income. Okay, that's like, that's my power increasing the ability of independent activity. Do I want to use that to accumulate wealth, or do I want to use that to share wealth? So those are my comments.
Sure. Excellent. Thank you, Brian. So I would say a couple of things. He's very explicit about what independence of action means. And he's very much aware that we are social beings, that we depend on each other in order, if you want to do anything of any scale at all, you have to work with people. What he's saying, and he knows the importance of working in teams. So, you can't escape that in the military. The point is that you cooperate with people where it is a win-win. You can formulate it in multiple ways. If it's a win-win, so for something like a good business relationship, a good marriage, it's a win-win. Both people are better off. Both people's ability to live goes up by being together. And whatever trade-offs, temporary trade-offs that you make, pay off handsomely in multiple ways. I mean, that's what a good relationship, whether a personal relationship or a professional relationship, is. It doesn't mean that you get everything, but your ability of living goes up in a good relationship. So that's what he's saying. And so he definitely includes kind of cooperation as being a crucial element of this. So that's what I would say. Next up is Sarika, Mike, and Jade. Sarika.
Okay, so this is kind of a complicated paper. But one of the thoughts that I had initially was kind of about the democratic peace theory. And especially because I guess this is sort of like a military context. So I guess the idea that, like, for example, if nations engage in capitalism with the United States, they're more likely to be peaceful with the United States because would be sharing resources and goods, and maybe they'd be released from what other government system they would have and be richer and have more independent action. But I was kind of confused about where, is there really cooperation going on, or is this just kind of like a hegemonic force? And is capitalism and democracy, while they're the best systems except for all the rest, which is what I think Winston Churchill said, I still just because of using that example, I still feel like I wonder what are the better systems out there, and does this model really challenge itself enough? I mean, it's talking about shattering ideas, but I'm not sure. It's complicated, but it was very interesting. I'll have to read the paper.
Thank you. I mean, these points about the political systems is a very large issue and too far removed. It is far more complex issue, which is basically, so to take this and apply to that, that's a very large enterprise by itself. And I don't think Boyd did that either. So it is beyond the scope of what we can do in this meetup. But thanks for the question. Next up is Mike, followed by Jade. Mike.
A couple things that have kind of already been said, but not quite explicitly. In fact, you said some of them. And 42nd Boyd used a different strategy for a dogfight in a simulator than he used for a Pentagon vendor RAND Corporation design review of the F-16 versus the TFX development. Sometimes ready, fire, aim is appropriate. And sometimes fire, get ready again, aim, fire again is appropriate. And sometimes you need to think positively about the thing, and sometimes you need to think about a worst case design. And some of that is different, not only different for different scenarios, but for different phases of the Ooda thing. You might observe using one strategy and one mindset, and action, as you described for the Hunger Hill war game, is a different strategy. Continuing on that line, a surgeon planning an operation might use a different strategy than Boyd might use in a dogfight. Measure once and cut twice, or measure twice, cut once, or something like that. And along those same lines, Heisenberg's uncertainty principle is not a measure of uncertainty, but is a measure of the certainty you get in a probability calculation. And similarly, Gödel's completeness thing is a test as to whether your axioms are consistent and complete. Mm-hmm. And he has another theorem called the incompleteness test to prove that your axioms are inconsistent and incomplete. So how you set your mind depends on the problem, and that in a way applies to how Biden might be negotiating a weapons disarmament treaty with Putin, or whether he'd get eaten alive.
Got it. Thank you, Mike. So what I would say is that I agree that, context of lives are different, and the kinds of strategies that you would need in order to operate are going to be different. They're going to be different in different phases of your life, different phases of a particular task or particular goal that you're trying to achieve. And this is all about being nimble to come up with concepts and strategies which are equal to what you're trying to do, and to achieve effectiveness, not be hung up with whatever strategy you or concepts that you had before, just because you had them before. So it is all about being flexible. And definitely as context change, you change context. I mean, that is the kind of heart of what he's saying. And the actually what the concepts are from person to person, or for a same person across fields, or for the same person in the same field in different phases will change. And they can change dramatically. That's what he's saying. Next up is Jade. Jade, go ahead.
Okay, I already spoke, so I'm going to try and be brief, but there's a lot going on. So I hear a lot of discussion about the concept of being independent, and I'm seeing it more as you're kind of supposed to be more like a free agent. You're more like an independent contractor. Independent contractor is independent. They can come and go as they please, but they always work with someone else. They're never really independent. Independence is really just something we kind of make up. No one is ever, even the most independent of us aren't independent. No man is an island. And so I feel like it's more about associating and disassociating strategically. so that your loyalty is such that you can come and go as you please and as you need. So like, I think a good brief example of this is like in the movies where you see a person from the pink army and from the blue army. They're both stranded and they have no way to get back to civilization on their own. So they have to work in tandem. Now, does that mean that they're necessarily allies and best friends? No, there's usually a lot of comedy because the two of them are butting heads a little bit, but survival is both of their main objectives. And for them each to satisfy that objective, they need to work in tandem and they need to cooperate, which is one of the things that he said. So then after they get off, they might be back in competition once they get back to safe land. But while they're still on their way, they both kind of know that, you know, I need you, you need me. And I think there's probably other stuff, but like I think that's the only that's relevant at this point in the conversation.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. See you soon. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye. Great.